Okay, everyone, so we are going to start out today with a couple of different videos. The first one is just a nice illustration of natural selection versus sexual selection, which is pretty cool. And then the second one is a David Attenborough video because, well, as I've told you, he's awesome. And what I want you to listen to is the greater lyre bird and the sounds that that bird can make while it's trying to attract a mate. Pretty awesome. So today we're going to talk about sexual selection first, and then we'll talk about other evolutionary processes like genetic drift and gene flow, and then we'll talk about a particularly applicable example, the wolves of Isle Royale. Hopefully you guys have heard of them, being that you've spent part of your time in Michigan. They're relatively famous around here. So what I want you guys to be able to do is differentiate natural selection from sexual selection, because there is a difference, okay? So sexual selection is a process where you have individuals that have heritable traits. We know that term. And they're more successful at attracting and obtaining mates, and therefore reproducing at a higher rate relative to other individuals in the population, and therefore spreading their genes. So I'm not sure how much you've been wandering through nature, or have at least done some reading about it. What you might observe is that the sexes often differ in things like morphology and behavior and physiology. And a lot of this is the males are distinct from the females because the males are trying to attract mates, okay? So many times the males will have, much brighter colors, much more ornamentation, things that might seem useless, but what they're trying to do, of course, is to attract that female mate so then they can reproduce and carry on their genes. So the way things tend to work in nature is that the males will usually compete more intensely for mates than females do. And honestly, the females in nature tend to be choosier about their mates than the males are. And you might be asking yourself, well, why is that? Well, like it or not, this is due to a process called anisogamy, where the gametes are different sizes. So let's think about this. Which sex makes many, many small gametes? And then which sex makes fewer large gametes? Okay? Given this particular situation, who should get to choose? So which partner is more invested? Should come relatively easy, just think about it. So if we've thought about this, okay, which sex makes many, many small gametes? Well, that's the males, okay? And which sex makes a fewer large gametes? Well, of course, that's the females. So eggs, like it or not, are energetically expensive. Okay, whereas the sperm are cheap from an energetic perspective. For this reason, the female needs to be more selective about who she mates with, and this is otherwise known as the fundamental asymmetry of sex. So there are two main forms of sexual selection. You guys should know this too: intrasexual and intersexual. So intra means within the sex, okay? So in other words, male-male competition. Intersexual means that it's between the two sexes, okay? So females are selecting for certain traits for males to have. Now, given that information, write that down. So when you have competition within a sex, okay, because intra is within, you will get, male reproductive traits like a larger size, larger weaponry, whatever is going to allow one male to be able to mate with the females over another competitor male. Okay, whereas the intersexual selection is between, so the female is choosing for male reproductive traits that she finds to be appealing, like colors, ornamentation. Some of the psychology behind this is if she finds a mate that doesn't have a lot of parasites, you can infer that from bright plumage, okay? If they have a lot of crazy ornamentation, then they probably have to be smart enough to outrun the predators. I mean, think of peacocks. They're absolutely beautiful, but those ridiculous tails do not help them outrun the predators, okay? So they have to be smart enough to be able to do so. So that indicates if they can survive with those traits, that they must have good genes. If you guys happen to have time, by the way, take a moment, pause lecture, and go on a Google field trip. And I want you to Google YouTube peacock spiders, because those guys do the cutest little dances where the males do, trying to attract their female mates. It's absolutely adorable. And some of them have actually been put to music, which is also adorable. So definitely take a moment. It's completely worth it, okay? Peacock spiders. And even if you don't like spiders, they're so cute. You will just, if you're like me, I'm not a huge fan of spiders. I respect them. I know their place in nature. They eat insects. I'm okay with that. They just need to do it outside of my house. But the peacock spiders are definitely well worth watching. Okay, so both the different types of selection we were just talking about a second ago lead to what's called sexual dimorphism. So the females often look very different from the males, okay? And that's because, realistically speaking, they're under different selection pressure. So the males are under pressure by the females and against other males to be the biggest and have the, most beautiful ornamentation and so forth. realistically speaking, very often the females are under selective pressure to be able to hide better because either the young are with them or they, are sitting on the nest or something along those lines. So this is why the two sexes tend to look very different. So one great example of intrasexual selection exists in northern elephant seals. So what happens with these guys is a large male can weigh up to 3 tons, okay, which is 2,700 kilograms, whereas the females will only weigh about 650 kilograms. So these guys are big, okay. So you'll have, a female will father the majority of offspring, okay, and so sexual selection is really intense. And most of this tends to be driven by male-male competition rather than female choice. And so the reality is reproductive success or fitness is more variable among the males than the females. So over 90% of the male seals will die without reproducing, whereas a few will be super successful and they'll father between 80 to 100 offspring. Okay. Now the females, it's much different. So only about 60% of the females die without leaving offspring. The most successful will produce up to 10 offspring. So there's a huge difference, okay, as far as who gets to have children and who doesn't. So given this information, how many offspring do most males father? Okay, I'm sorry that the slide is wonky. It's just the conversion. Take a moment, address this question. This is real data from long-term field studies, okay, and come up with your answer. Okay, so given the graphs that we're looking at here, you'll see that most of the males actually father 0 offspring. Okay, therefore A is the correct answer. So remember, whenever you see a graph, you read the axes first, okay, and then you interpret and see what the data is actually trying to show you. Now, given this information, this should be an easy question. Which sex experiences more intense intra-sexual selection? Remember what intra means. Stop for a moment and then go ahead and answer the question. So hopefully it makes sense based on what we've talked about. And we said this in a few slides ago. The males are the ones who experience the most intense intrasexual selection, which is why the males, only one of them or a few of them will father the majority of the offspring. So it's an interesting system. Okay, so when it comes to intrasexual selection, this is one of my favorite examples to talk about because it's so cool from an evolutionary perspective. So, males have intense intrasexual selection. And because of that, there's 3 different types of males that evolved. Okay, so there's 3 different mating tactics, and these are bluegill sunfish. And part of the reason this is so cool is I had a friend in grad school that actually used to work on these guys. And I always say choose your topic in grad school very carefully because basically she would spend her day fishing. And she would be catching the males and seeing who was where and tagging them and so forth. And she really absolutely loved it. But the way it works with these guys is that, again, there's 3 mating tactics. There's the parental male, and those are the big guys that try to scare off any potential competitors, okay? There's what's called a female mimic, otherwise known as a satellite male. All right, and so those males look just like the female. And so if you're looking at the picture that's on the left, you see the parental male, the female, and the female mimic. Okay, and then there's another type of male that's called a sneaker male. And so the sneaker males will come in and they'll try to spread their genes, hurry up, and then they run. Okay, so gotta admit, it's a really unique system, but it's pretty obvious if you're a parental or a territorial male and you see a female mimic that you're not going to end up chasing that one away because you think it's another female. Okay, the parental males, of course, are competing with one another and they scare off anybody else that looks similar to them. And of course, the female choose the ones based on the brightest color and so forth. But then the sneaker male, those guys are really interesting too, that they try to come in, hurry up and shed some sperm and then run off before the large parental male catches on. So what's interesting about the males too is that they mature at age 7 and they'll actually defend the nest and care for the young. Okay, so they're investing a lot in these guys. But then there's the 2 cuckolder versions, the cuckolder male, the sneaker male, and the satellite male. You know, again, one looks like the female, the other one comes in and tries to sneak. Satellite looks like a female, but it will release sperm instead of eggs during spawning. And then the sneaker male will swim quickly to a nest, release its sperm below the spawning pair, and then try to take off before it's detected. So obviously this selection has worked because of the fact that all 3, of these types of competition, these guys are still around. So, something's working in their favor. So given this information, with respect to the phenotype of body size, what type of selection do you think produces 3 distinct male morphs? Okay, so stop. Read through the choices, okay, figure out which ones you can eliminate, and then choose the one that you feel is the most fitting given what you know. So given what we talked about, choice B should make sense because remember, it's intrasexual, it's between the males that's driving this. Okay, it's not really directional because of the fact it's not always going one way. Definitely not stabilizing because you've got these extremes, so it's not stabilizing, it's not balancing, which leaves us with disruptive, okay? So hopefully that makes sense, and if not, let me know. Okay, so mating can actually be kind of strange in other species. One example is in damselflies. So males have evolved claspers so they can clutch the female, and believe it or not, a penis that has a scrub brush. Okay, so female positions herself just right. The male then scrubs the old sperm from the female sperm storage organ, deposits his sperm. Sounds completely crazy, but here's a question for you. Is this considered intersexual selection or intrasexual selection? Okay, think about who's actually competing here. So given this situation, it's going to be B, intrasexual selection. Okay, because one male is trying to compete with the other male. So in finches, we have an interesting example of sexual selection, but it's intersexual because it's female choice. So male zebra finches, these guys are carried in just about any pet store, and they have these little orange patches on their cheeks, and they're usually pretty bright. And so what researchers were wondering is if it's the bright orange patches that are selected for. So they took some males and fed them carotenoid supplements, and this would cause the beak and the cheek patches to be much brighter. Okay, so when this actually happened, it turns out that 9 of 10 females actually preferred the more colorful males. And again, the brighter they are, that signals potential better genes, you know, that they can outsmart their predators and so forth. And so this tends to be what the females are looking for. So let's talk about another favorite that you can very often find in pet stores. Not necessarily this species, however, but you can definitely find some guppies. And if you've ever seen guppies, you'll know that they have a lot of variation in color patterns. So they can have spots and patches that differ depending upon size and color and number of spots. It turns out that the color genes are only expressed in males. Okay, once again, sexual dimorphism. But in some populations, males are typically drab, and others, they're very conspicuous. And so what researchers wanted to know is why. And so researchers came up with some interesting hypotheses regarding these male guppies. One is that the color patterns have evolved through natural selection. A second one, that camouflage males are favored by predator avoidance. Okay, so that's natural selection. Then the idea that brightly colored, and patterned males would be favored by females through sexual selection, and that there's some sort of trade-off between attracting your mate and avoiding your predator. So let's think about this. How could we conduct an experiment where we can actually address this question? Stop and take a moment and think through it. So the way they tested this was to have a mixture of, brightly colored and spotted guppies as well as some drab and small spotted guppies, okay? And they placed them into some small gravel locations. And in one situation, they had the presence of a predator, okay? And they watched over 15 generations to see how the population would change. And they were with fine gravel, by the way, so the smaller spots would help them to hide. And they also had fine gravel, but no predator. Okay, and once again, fewer than 15 generations of selection. And look, how cool is that? Okay, the small spots, of course, were predator avoidance because they were trying to blend in. Whereas the larger spots, when there's no predator, obviously that's sexual selection. So their patterns really are due to a result of both. Now, seriously, 15 generations, that is pretty cool. Okay, so given what we just talked about before, I want you to pause lecture again, and I want you to choose which of the following best explains the result from the previous slide. Okay, there's no tricks. Read through this and figure out which one is every single part true. Okay, and eliminates the ones where things are not true. Okay, so keeping everything in mind, okay, let's go through and read these answers. So you should have chosen C if everything went well. So A, making small spots is energetically more expensive. We don't know this. We have no idea. We didn't even talk about energy, okay? B, large spots are attractive to females in all environments, so males evolve large spots, no, in the absence of predators. I don't like that one, okay? You can't say all environments. And again, I know we don't have multiple choice. I'm trying to gear you guys up for 172. Okay, so I'm trying to teach you how to think for the next classes. And, all environments, as soon as you see that, chuck it. Okay, because unless it's a very special situation where they've said all environments before, that one's baloney. All right, D, spot size is influenced by disruptive natural selection. Those males with small and large spots are favored. Males with medium-sized spots are selected against. There's no guarantee of that either. We didn't even talk about medium size. Okay. And then spot size is controlled by directional natural selection, whereas spot color is controlled. We haven't even talked about that either. Okay, so that leaves us with C. Fine gravel and no predators. Males with large spots have higher fitness because they're noticed by females. Fine gravel and predators. Males that blend in with their environment have a higher fitness. Now, every single part of this is true. Okay, and because of that, you want to choose C. All right, so again, I'm trying to teach you how they think, so when 172 comes along and you're taking those multiple choice exams, or whatever future biology class you guys are taking where they have multiple choice exams, you guys know what to look for. Okay, now it's time for us to talk about other evolutionary processes, because there's other things that actually can cause a population to evolve besides selection. Okay, one is called genetic drift, and the other is called gene flow, and so we'll talk about them in the upcoming section. Okay, so something that's very important to be able to figure out is called allele frequency. Okay, and so this is considering alleles from a population perspective. And so if you have, remember, we're talking about diploid individuals, okay, but you want to know the percent or frequency or proportion of a specific allele in a gene in a population. And let's say you happen to be asked the question, what's the frequency of the little a allele? Okay, now what I want you to do is to stop the lecture, okay, to count up all of the little a alleles and use the formula below, okay, and answer the question. It's really important that you guys can do this because we're going to start getting into population genetics soon, and I want you to feel comfortable with it. Okay, so take a moment, stop lecture, and dive in. All right, ideally, if you added everybody up correctly, you should have 0.5 or half. Okay, so this also tells you, by the way, that you should be able to add up the big allele frequency. So what I want you to do now is go through and add up the big allele frequency, okay, and then calculate and figure out what the percentage is. So by now you should already know that it should be, the total allele frequency is going to be 1 or 100%. 50% is little a, so what's left for big A? That should also be 50%, okay? Make sure that this makes sense. It's really important when we start getting into the complicated parts of population genetics, which we will soon. Okay, so the first term we're going to define is genetic drift. Okay, so genetic drift is basically changing in allele frequencies through time, but this is due to random sampling. So not everybody, just by chance, is going to be able to reproduce and have offspring. Okay, so you can go from one generation that looks like the generation on the bottom left, okay, and let's say only those individuals that are outlined in white end up reproducing. So then you go through and you get generation 2. Well, then just by chance, again, only those individuals in white end up reproducing, and so then you get a population of all red. Okay, so you've lost the frequency of white alleles, okay, and you're left with all red. Well, that's changing gene frequency through time, but it's not due to natural selection. It's just due to chance and random sampling, because not everybody would get a chance to reproduce. Okay, so that's the difference. So genetic drift is not just this abstract concept that never actually happens. You can actually see it in real life too, okay? Fruit flies are a great example of this. So fruit flies can have a situation where they have normal bristles, type A, or they have forked and kind of bent bristles, okay? So if you start a study and you have 96 vials with 4 male and 4 female, and they're randomly selected for each generation to mate and produce the next generation, after 16 generations, okay, in 29 of the vials, the forked allele is fixed, okay? In 41, the normal allele is fixed. In only 26 vials, both of them are present. So keeping this in mind, read the graph to the left, okay? So again, this just should reinforce what's going on. But basically what happens, in 73% of the population, genetic drift had reduced genetic diversity, and they were fixed for either one allele or the other. So this does happen in nature. So another question to address when we're talking about genetic drift is, what will the impact of population size be? Okay, and so the way researchers solve this is they used computer simulations. We've talked about this before, and they're often used in population genetics to determine the changes in allele frequencies under different scenarios and what you might expect. So let's say you start out with a population size of 10. Okay, how will that impact genetic drift versus starting out with a population size of 1,000? All right, stop and take a moment and think about this. Think through it. Okay, and you're starting the frequency of A is equal to 0.5. What do you think will happen to the allele frequency over time, given what we just talked about the couple of slides, or the last slide? So as you might expect, when you start out with a population size of 10, your allele is either fixed or lost relatively quickly. Okay. However, if you have a large enough population size, you can basically maintain your alleles for much longer, if not for indefinitely, as long as your population size stays large. Okay. So drift really only impacts smaller populations compared to, when you're considering larger populations. Okay, so we just talked about this experiment, okay? And part of science is learning how to apply the information as well. So let's say in the experiment with 96 fruit fly populations, okay, after 16 generations, we know had been fixed. But what would you expect if they had allowed, rather than 4 males and 4 females, if they had allowed for 15 males and 15 males and 15 females to breed for every generation? Read through this, and it's not E. So remember, if you're starting out with 15 females and males, okay, and you allow them to breed for each generation, more than likely less of the 73% would be fixed, okay, and that should make sense. The results are not going to be the same because you're tripling basically the number that are going to be breeding. It's not going to be more because it's only when they're smaller that they're going to get fixed. Okay, so 27%, nah, that's got nothing to do with it, okay, which takes us to C, and C should be the correct answer, and hopefully that makes sense. So the way that you get small populations, which tend to be impacted by genetic drift, you can have what's called a founder event or a founder effect, where just a few individuals will go establish a new population, then everybody that is in that population comes from them. So the only ones that are going to, the only genotypes they're going to have are what they brought with them. Okay. Another possibility is if you go through what's called a genetic bottleneck, where you start out with a large population, then something bad happens where you have a lot of mortality and only a few individuals at random happen to survive. The population will grow again, but because of the fact that it's only from those few individuals, you're going to go through you're definitely losing your genetic diversity. Okay, so even though it's going to get bigger again, you still don't have much genetic diversity until mutations can build up again, and that takes a lot of time. Now, another influence you can have from an evolutionary perspective, let's say you have two populations that get split by a geographic barrier, and I'm sorry, again, the slides are a little bit wonky on this version. Now, eventually they could diverge over time. Okay, however, let's say that something happens and the mountain range erodes and the populations become connected. If that actually happens, that can actually increase your genetic variation by bringing new variants over to the other side. Now, theoretically, it could also decrease genetic variation if it brought bad alleles that started mixing with alleles that were adapted to the environment, and then for whatever reason, the population would crash. Okay, so that's one way that it could definitely decrease genetic variation. But I think that tends to be a much more rare scenario. Most of the time it's going to increase variation because it's bringing in new genes with whoever happens to be migrating in. Okay, it's time for us to discuss the wolves of Isle Royale, and hopefully you guys have heard of them. They're relatively famous in the UP, and they're definitely a population worth conserving, and we always try and keep an eye on them. Okay, so I don't know if you all have seen this meme before, but I thought it was adorable, and I've seen it before. And considering the fact I have 4 lazy couch dogs that used to be wolves at one point in time, I thought it was rather fitting. So yes, all dogs came from wolves. We know this. Okay, and so all the breeds we have today, but there are some wolves that are still left, and some of them in particular in Isle Royale, researchers are trying to conserve and figure out how to save them. So the story of the wolves of Isle Royale began in the 1940s when there was a very frozen bridge between the mainland and Island Royale, and approximately 20 or so wolves managed to mosey on over. Well, eventually the weather warmed and that particular bridge would melt and they would get stuck there. Now, there's no evidence of wolves being there beforehand, but there are a lot of moose, and so they definitely do have plenty of food. Now, at one point in time, there would only be 3 wolves left, and so the number of the wolves would definitely fluctuate, okay? And this would not be a good thing because, of course, we've talked earlier how, you want to maintain a larger population size in order to maintain genetic diversity. So the next slide should be a video, and if it doesn't load, I'll make sure to put it in the announcements. So given this information, take a moment and go ahead and address the question. Okay, and figure out which one best fits the blanks. All right, so you can easily eliminate 3 of these right away, and then it's just down to the last 2, and go from there. So given the information we had, hopefully B was your correct answer, not B, A. Okay, so the founder event as well as genetic drift. Now the reason it's not a bottleneck is the population never got that large yet. Okay, and so it definitely drifted because it stayed small, but there are still very few individuals there. Okay, so that's why I would have chosen that answer over the other one. Now, the question is, what effects will a small population size have? Well, unfortunately, we know that that population is suffering from spinal deformities from a recessive allele. Okay, so once you have inbreeding, you see the increased expression of these recessive alleles because there's nothing to cover them. So there's no heterozygotes or anything like that. And so if you think about it, what type of selection is acting on this phenotype? What's going to go against them? Okay, and what evolutionary process could be acting on them that results in a high frequency? So all of these are actual real questions that scientists have to deal with as they manage the wolves of Isle Royale. Okay, so let's talk about the answers to the last slide. So it's definitely negative selection because it's going against the spinal deformities. Okay, and it's definitely in a direction. So it's directional selection. Okay, so that's definitely, and what evolutionary processes are acting that result in a high frequency? Well, you have genetic drift. It's causing, due to lack of diversity in the original population. Hopefully that makes sense. Now let's talk about this one. Okay, so parvovirus, this poor population appeared on the island, and it plummeted from 50 to 14. Now, eventually it would grow again. That's a hint. Okay, so and then when it was small, what would be the evolutionary process that reduced the genetic diversity in the wolf population? So hopefully if you guys are looking at this, you're going to choose B because they gave you the hint that the population grew again. Okay, so they've bounced around, even got as low as where they lost 3 individuals that fell into a well. Talk about depressing. I'm rooting for this population, but man, they're just going through a lot. Now, in 1997, there was one Canadian wolf, that male, that would walk across the ice bridge, and he started to have pups with the females. Okay, so what impact do you think he would have had on the genetic diversity? Well, if you look at this graph, okay, and you read the years are in the x-axis and alleles from the new wolf is on the y, he drastically increased the genetic diversity. So him being there was actually a big help to the population, and it happened naturally as he moseyed on over across the ice bridge. Okay, so this is a chance where you guys get to earn an extra credit point. So what I want you to do for your extra credit point, and I'm going to upload a spot for you to put it on Canvas, is I want you to find the current status, the most recent status that you can find of the Island Royale population. Okay, so you guys figure that out, and then you can upload the file to Canvas, and you'll get an extra credit point, and then you get to keep updated with what's going on in science and nature and all sorts of other good stuff. So let me know what you find. I'll set that up tonight, tomorrow with the absolute latest. So given what we've discussed, this should be a piece of cake. Okay, so what does genetic do with regards to genetic variation, and how does gene flow impact genetic variation as well? So given what we've talked about, the genetic drift should really decrease, okay? And gene flow resulting from migration, well, in the last example, it definitely increased, all right? There are situations, though, where they can break up good alleles, and so allele combinations, and so those individuals that are brought in bring in some bad things for that environment. So in theory, potentially it could decrease it, okay? But for us, just realize it could either potentially increase or decrease depending upon the situation. So here we have an example where the gene flow could actually cause an issue. So in this particular island, there are birds that are adapted to that environment, and so they tend to do better when they are adapted to that environment. However, when you get genes coming in from the mainland, tends to counteract the effects of selection, all right? In which case you get new alleles coming in, and so then the survival rate does not, get helped. It just depends on what alleles come in and are brought in with that environment. Again, just a real world example. Sometimes nature does some crazy things. So this will be all the lectures for Wednesday. Okay, this one and the last one. And if you guys have any questions or if you need anything, let me know. And I wish you safe and healthy next couple of days, and I'll talk to you on Friday.